It's everyone's friend, it's Tyler. It's everyone's friend, it's Tyler. It's everyone's friend, it's Tyler.
A lot of people will have these blocks. They'll say, I don't believe in God or Jesus or Christianity because I think it was all made up. It's a myth or a fairy tale or a legend.
When people think about the word myth, what they typically do is associate the word with falsehood, meaning that there is no sort of truth behind the whole entire story or the series of events that actually occur. But the reality is that truth itself is very complicated depending upon what you're talking about, because there are two types of truth. The first type of truth is something that is known as scientific truth. That is to say, if you can actually test something and repeat it, it might be pretty true when it comes down to the scientific realm. When it comes down to philosophical truth, that means that although the story itself may not be literally real, you can actually find good moral lessons behind that particular story. And so you can actually find philosophical truth within mythology when you actually read the stories with a clear-cut mind. Myths, according to Britannica, are specific accounts of gods or superhuman beings involved in the extraordinary events or circumstances in a time that is unspecific, but in which it's understood as existing apart from ordinary human experience. The term mythology denotes both the study of myth and the body of myths belonging to a particular religious tradition. So while I do in fact think that myths are not necessarily, you can say, scientifically true, they can actually be philosophically true in the sense that the stories actually have good moral lessons. Truth itself cannot necessarily be determined just by science, because you need philosophy to also find truth and meaning in this life.
They'll say that Jesus is just another mythical god pieced together from other mythical gods that already existed, such as Mithras, Horus, Dionysus, and others, or that there's really no evidence in the first couple hundred years that proves he even existed, or that some guy named Jesus, not the Son of God, probably did exist, but everything else about him was made up and added on later. Now, I'm not going to say a lot about these, but I will say this. For the first, this idea that Jesus was just an amalgamation of other ancient mythical gods who, according to this, had virgin births, were baptized, had 12 disciples, performed the same miracles, and were crucified, died, and resurrected as Savior of the world. Well, none of this is true. These claims can all be traced back to a couple guys in the 18 and 1900s who had no evidence.
The argumentation that was actually presented right now was that because there was actually scholars in the past that compared and contrast the miracles as told in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, therefore it might be false because they were not necessarily 100% accurate when it came down to their own personal comparison. Therefore, that's why many people on the internet actually believe that the miracles were actually from other stories. However, that's not necessarily the case for people like me. You see, when I was younger, I was actually baptized in the Catholic faith, and so most of my childhood life, I basically went to church every single Sunday. I would also basically partake in plays when I was younger. For example, one year, I would be like the three wise men, and the other year, I would also play as Joseph, the father of Jesus Christ. I would also, when I was my teenage year, would actually partake in church as an altar server. And so what I would do is I actually carry the cross of Jesus Christ. When I was on the stage, I was ring the bells. I would give the priest a copy of the Bible for him to read, and so on and so forth. And so I was actually active in the Catholic Church during my youth, when I was my childhood and also my teenage years. However, through my own personal self-study, I bought a series of different books when I was 17 years old about this particular topic on the issue of comparative mythology. For example, I would buy Egyptian mythology right here. I would also buy Norse mythology right here. I would also buy Mesopotamian mythology, but my favorite of the bunch by far is actually Greek mythology. Now, the street places that I actually found out that's actually closest to the Bible when I was 17 years old was actually Mesopotamia, ancient Greeks, and ancient Egypt. And when I compared and contrast the miracles of Jesus to the Greek gods, I realized that there was actually a deep connections of the miracles as told in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the stories of the Greek gods. There's actually a book that is known as Miracles and Greco-Roman Antiquity that has a list of different miracle claims that actually occur way before the New Testament actually was written down. For example, Hercules had the ability to heal all diseases. So too did Asclepius. When it comes down to the idea of miraculous conception, there was actually Plato, who was like a famous philosopher, and it has been said that he was actually born directly from miraculous conception, according to one of the accounts that's actually been written down. When it comes down to the whole entire notion of like walking on water, we have Hermes, for example, from the Odyssey that had the ability to also walk on water. I believe the son of Poseidon, according to Jason the Argonauts, can also have the ability to basically walk on water as well. And so many of these miracle claims actually pre-existed way before the New Testament was actually written down, way before a guy was actually named Jesus walking around and people making these claims of these miracles. And so I would say, in the context of the Greco-Roman society, having these kind of miracle claims that Jesus had was not necessarily new. Basically, the main reason why they want to have these kind of miracle claims that were actually assigned to Jesus is to make sure that he's actually bigger and better than everybody else in that particular social conflict in that time period. And so it's not necessarily far-fetched to say that culture directly influenced other kind of cultures to use certain motifs to make their gods bigger and better, because ideas themselves, they don't necessarily exist within a vacuum. Ideas, philosophies are inspired from other philosophies or other ideas to make something bigger and better than ever before. So I don't think it's actually a good idea to dismiss the claims just because some scholars in the past have gotten wrong, when in reality scholarship on this particular topic for comparative Mostology has gotten better as time actually progress.
For the second, this idea that there's no evidence within the first few centuries that proves Jesus even existed, well, there's plenty of evidence. Just open a Bible, New Testament. Those are all first century accounts written by a bunch of very different guys who were all alive when Jesus was alive.
I am not a Jesus mythicist whatsoever. That being said, it's not necessarily true to say that Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John were actually eyewitnesses in the slightest, because most scholars, both secular and Christians, have recognized that the Gospels, as written down, were done by people who were not necessarily there at the events when the miracles allegedly happened. And so you need to actually be more careful when it comes down to particular details like this.
There's also non-Christian evidence from Jewish and Roman historians, from those who are opposed to Jesus, and from those who didn't even like him.
While it's true that there were actually non-Christian historians that wrote down about this particular Jesus, it is not true to say that the people who wrote him down in those records were actually there at the same time that Jesus was actually alive. They were writing down reports about what the followers had to say about Jesus when he was actually alive.
There's really no evidence of Alexander the Great until 400 years after he died, but he existed, right? Even if you don't believe in Jesus Christ, Son of God, you can't just throw away all the evidence. That's too easy. Which is why today nearly all historians, whether Christians or not, accept that Jesus existed.
You kind of shot yourself in the foot, because with the case of Alexander the Great, there were actually people that were actually close to Alexander the Great that wrote down about his particular actions. And so what happened was, for the case of the biography of Alexander the Great, they took those historical records that those people wrote down and actually combined them together for the biography. So even though it was like 400 years later after he actually passed away, the reality is that the biography was actually based upon documentations of those people that were close to Alexander the Great. Meanwhile, for the case of Jesus, nobody that was actually alive who wrote down about Jesus was actually there when Jesus was there. I'm not saying that, of course, Jesus did not necessarily exist, but it's like a complete difference between the two people that we're talking about here.
Which brings us to the last one, that some radical preacher named Jesus probably did exist, but everything else about him was religious embellishment at best or completely and totally made up at worst. Some say it was made up by his disciples, the Romans, by Constantine, by a bunch of rich white guys in Rome who wanted a lot of power, or just by sitting around the campfire telling stories over and over and over again. Well, the earliest evidence of Christianity that's pretty solid shows it was already fairly well established by around 64 AD. And most of the New Testament is thought to have been written between the 50s and the 70s, so we know it couldn't have been made up after this.
This idea, this notion that the historical Jesus was actually embellished over time operates on something that is known as methodological naturalism. That is to say, that it does not assume either way that there is no such thing as a supernatural, but try to operate on the ideas of what's the most plausible explanation for that particular scenario. I would say that's the idea that I personally subscribe to when it comes to this whole entire matter, largely because time and time again, we have plenty of famous people like celebrities or political leaders in our personal lifetimes that have actually been deified by many people. For example, we have deifications of people like Kim Jong-un. We have deifications of people like Donald Trump, even though he's still alive. So this idea, this notion that people can actually be deified over like a short period of time period is not necessarily anything new, both past and present. And so if we can actually apply the same kind of logic that we apply to famous celebrities that were actually deified, to politicians that were also deified, how come we cannot necessarily apply the same kind of logic but for Jesus as well?
And it's unlikely that his disciples made it up because, well, they all died very brutal, violent deaths for it. And yes, people die all the time for things they believe are true. But would you die for something you knew was a lie?
I don't think the argumentation is that the people who actually died were not necessarily sincere about their beliefs, but rather, just because someone believes something is true doesn't mean that X is actually true. That's the objection of that particular claim that you refer to. Because plenty of people throughout history have died for false beliefs that make no sort of sense whatsoever. Let's take, for example, the case of the Prophet Muhammad. It has been stated that the Prophet Muhammad had the ability to split the moon. Now, most people who are not Muslims buy into the idea that Muhammad actually split the moon because we have no such evidence of a guy actually splitting the moon. And so most non-Muslims, myself included, don't believe in the ideas that Muhammad actually split the moon. Similarly, there are some Mormons who are also persecuted for their personal belief system. Some of the ideas that are crazy is the fact that they believe that they have magic underwear, but because the Mormons were actually persecuted in the past, does that now mean that the underwear is actually magical? I don't think so. So it's not a question that people were not sincere about their beliefs. It's a question of whether or not the beliefs themselves are actually founded in reality.
What it all boils down to is this. Is this man-made, or is it from God? Now, my question is, don't you think you'd be able to tell the difference? I mean, wouldn't the gap between what is man-made and what is divine be huge and immense? I mean, if I put something in front of you and said this was either man-made or from God, don't you think you'd be able to tell just by looking at it?
The thing about the car example is that we actually do in fact know the intentionality behind the car, largely because you can go to any type of company across the world, find them construct cars, they have different kind of parts to make the car, we have blueprints of people playing out for the car, and so from the blueprints they actually create different parts to create the car. However, for some strange reason, when you make the example of other things that were actually supposedly designed and that the Christian God is actually the designer of those things, it's really interesting that everything that begins to exist requires a cause. But when you compare the watchmaker and say that everything needs a watchmaker, and of course by that logic it would also mean that God would also need a creator that created that God and vice versa. But apparently that's not, of course, a good answer for many Christians because that logic for them doesn't necessarily follow. But more so to the point, it seems to know that the only way you can actually refer to intentionality itself is the fact that you were born in a predominantly Christian culture, and so that predominant Christian culture is going to be the Christian God. But if you were actually raised in a Muslim culture and a Hindu culture or other cultures with different religions around the world, you will say that that's the God that actually created the entire world. So it seems that it's a question of personal preferences of where you were actually born in to determine what God is actually real and what God is actually fake. But my final point for this whole entire objection that I have is that why does it necessarily have to be a supernatural cause? For example, could it not be possible that the universe itself always existed in some shape of another? Could it be a fact that nature itself was actually something that caused itself to happen and not some sort of hand in guide behind the whole entire case of nature? Could it be the fact that basically maybe, just maybe, not everything is like a direct result of cause and effect because of vertical particles that pop in and out of existence? So a lot of naturalistic explanations could be explained on why something is X, Y, and Z. So why exactly do we need to rely on a supernatural explanation based upon what we observe and see right now?
I think you could tell. I think we all could tell because we all have that built-in meter inside us that detects on one side and truth on the other. And truth is what we're looking for here.
I absolutely agree that truth is wanted. Like I said earlier in the video, truth comes in two forms: philosophical truth as well as objective reality. And I think besides the fact that we all need this type of philosophical truth to know what's right and wrong, I would also think that objective reality is something that's also really important too. That being said, a personal belief, a personal faith cannot, will not, and has ever been demonstrated to be objective reality itself. Something that's testable, measurement, and actually have proof behind the claim. Because ultimately in the end, it's a personal belief system, and that's it. That's your own personal truth, but it's not necessarily detective of reality itself. For my case, I'm perfectly fine to say that the truth of the matter is, objectively, is that we just simply have no idea, and that the main reason why we have these gods, these stories, these legends, these myths, is because people back then had no idea how things work. I just so happen to go one God further and apply this particular logic to the Christian God too. And so I don't claim to know any more than anybody else, right? I'm perfectly okay to say that I have no idea about the origin of the universe. However, I am not going to make any type of claim about the state of the universe and say that my particular belief about that claim is actually the truth. Because ultimately in the end, I think it's much more honest to say that I have no idea about the origin of the universe and how things came to be. But what do you guys think about my personal response? Tell me in the comment section down below. And as always, I'll see you guys in in the next video.
It's everyone's friend, it's Tyler. He's your only black friend, so he's your best black friend. I won't trade him for another black friend, because black friends are rare, as you should be aware. He smiles like Richard Pryor, so just sit and stare. It's everyone's friend, it's Tyler. It's everyone's friend, it's Tyler. It's everyone's friend, it's Tyler.